Yeah, thank you for that lovely introduction, and how exciting to follow that fantastic paper by Catherine and also be between her and Alan Bryce. So we're very honoured to be here. Gary is going to share my talk in a minute, but just before that, I just thought I'd really quickly introduce the Centre for Contemporary Legend for anybody who doesn't know who we are. We're a group of academics forming a research group, as Melody said, at Sheffield Hallam University, continuing a long tradition of folklore scholarship in Sheffield. And it includes myself with an interest in film and media and folklore, Andrew, who has interests in traditions and customs and also has a background in photography, and our colleagues who aren't here today, Sophie Parks-Neild, who has a background in creative writing and also is interested in traditions and customs, and Dr. David Clark, who has written loads of books about UFOs and all sorts of stuff, right, lots of cool stuff. So we do all sorts of projects, one of which is currently curating an issue of Revenant Journal, which a number of you are probably familiar with, peer-reviewed journal. We're doing a special contemporary legend issue. We've accepted a significant archive from Professor John Widdowson, which is an interesting folklore archive. I'm personally this close to submitting my PhD on folklore, folk horror and British television, so I'm very excited. And just to introduce my paper, I actually pre-recorded my paper as a video just around before this conference was going to take place in December. So that's why it's got the wrong date on the start when you see it. Also, for a couple of reasons, I had COVID and I was very ill for about 3 weeks, and I wanted to still be able to take part, so I thought I'd record my presentation. And I also really wanted to make sure I kept to time, so I will stop adding onto that time now. So if Gary could share my video as discussed, I would greatly appreciate it. The ethereal Gary, are you able to do that? Hello, my name's Diane Rodgers. I'm one of the co-founders of the Centre for Contemporary Legend at Sheffield Hallam University. Thank you very much for having my paper today. Now, the notion of folk horror as a distinct subgenre, as evidenced by the existence of this conference itself, has clearly developed in leaps and bounds since its post-2000 revival. The most often cited examples that are considered classic folk horror are still tend to be these from British 1970s cinema. More recent folk horror titles released today continue to echo qualities from this earlier period and puts them very much in the same generic category. So it's all of these types of films together to which I will be referring to as classic folk horror. Now, in 2018, when I spoke to Ben Wheatley, who has directed films considered seminal in the modern folk horror canon, he wondered aloud in my interview with him. He said, "Isn't folk horror all horror?" Well, I went away and I thought about this, and I thought, well, no, it isn't. But I am going to explain my workings out. In my discussion with Ben Wheatley, we went on to talk about folkloric tales of vampires and other monsters, and he quite rightly wondered, isn't the werewolf's tale a folk horror tale? That's all folk tale stuff. So most horror is folk. Now, for the purposes of this paper, I'm taking as a given that folklore is absolutely integral to folk horror narratives. I and others have already argued this elsewhere, and I'm not really going to go into that further here. But I do want to acknowledge that the roots of horror in general are firmly based in some sort of folk tales. Horror is the stuff of folklore. It's unofficially recorded stories, campfire tales, myth and urban legend. So although all horror might include folklore, not all horror is folk horror, at least in terms of how the term is generically applied today. So much of what is written about folk horror focuses on trying to define its nuances, looking at abstract representations, complex thematic patterns, or the on-screen use of liminal spaces, notions of hauntological or fuzzy memory, and immersive, unsettling atmospheres. And I feel kind of like this is very much from the inside looking out. So this paper is really me just thinking aloud about folk horror from a different, maybe more simplistic perspective. I want to kind of take a step back and examine it from the outside looking in, to look at it very broadly, to see if it helps pull some ideas into focus. Now, in order to do this, I just want to give you an academic trigger warning. I will be making some sweeping generalizations. I may even contradict myself. However, I do think it's useful sometimes to take a step back and make broad comparisons to gain a degree of clarity, and even play devil's advocate a bit to get a wider view about the aesthetics of folk horror. To establish what something is, sometimes it's useful to show what it isn't. So if you find these kind of generalizations awkward or uncomfortable, for your own comfort and safety at any point, please feel free to mentally add #NotAllHorror to any statements you may find upsetting. So with that out of the way, I am going to state that folk horror is not classic horror. Now, I'm using classic horror in the broadest sense as arguably established by Universal in the 1930s and their enduring iconography associated with legendary monsters. Dracula in 1931 became synonymous with Bela Lugosi, whilst Frankenstein, of course, was embodied in the same year by Boris Karloff. The successful Universal Monsters series really reinforced public perception of and familiarity with these iconographic characters, helping to cement what became distinct conventions on screen for the horror genre. Some of the most instantly recognisable relate to stylistic choices in terms of lighting, music and sound to create atmosphere and the visual presentation of the monsters themselves. Now, across these elements, classic horror offers an abundance of visual drama. There are low-key lighting effects creating large areas of shadow on screen from which a monster might pop out at any moment, or underlighting, distorting features to make them appear more intense or sinister. But in every case, these commonly used effects tend to be dramatic and theatrical, and thus a significant proportion of horror films take place in a dark setting or at night. The music of classic horror is similarly dramatic. There's orchestral grandiosity giving weight to narratives, or sweeping symphonic strings underlining impending disaster, such as Max Steiner's thematic score for King Kong in 1933. And of course, a specific narrative use of music in classic horror is to employ musical stabs, which build or create tension or accompany scary moments or attacks, eliciting physical jump scare reactions from an audience. Again, a classic example is the infamous shower scene in Psycho. Dramatic high-tension music on horror scores persists across the genre throughout decades, with recurring motifs such as the pounding heartbeat of Carpenter's Halloween theme and high-octane heavy metal or punk bands often featuring on soundtracks, such as with the recent Fear Street trilogy on Netflix. Now, again, with the slasher films of the 70s and 80s, narratives were built around clearly defined character monsters, drawing not so much from Gothic literature this time, but other areas of folklore and urban legend. Wes Craven's iconic Dreamstalker Freddy Krueger, for example, was a modern take on the manifestation of nightmares and sleep paralysis, which is in fact an area written extensively upon by folklorist David Hufford. Similarly, Halloween, Friday the 13th, use myths like the escaped Psycho and also the Hookman urban legend, later used by Candyman and I Know What You Did Last Summer, both in the 90s, and of course Candyman has been recently remade. And this is an enduring folkloric trope which began circulation amongst teenagers in 1950s America. A vast proportion of these classic horror films rely upon a central, specific monstrous figure who, though lurking in on-screen shadows, are distinctly iconic. The striped jumper, worn fedora or razor-claw glove immediately identify Freddy in the same way that a cape and fangs identify Dracula. They're easily defined in physical terms, whether it's a hockey mask, striped jumper or hook for a hand. There are visual extremes as well, of special effects, bloody deaths, lurid lighting, gory cartoonish violence, and all these things meant that horror films became less favourably looked upon by critics, and it was precisely this perception that director Piers Haggard was trying to move away from when he first used the phrase folk horror in 2003. He wanted to separate his work from more typical horror. Whilst the murder spree, schlock and gore antics of Freddy, Jason, Michael Myers have clear origins in folk myths, satanic panics and urban legends, the films in which such iconic monsters appear are not what we think of as folk horror. In many examples of folk horror, it's rare that a monster or threat is distinctly knowable, if there is even a well-defined threat at all. For example, in a 1974 episode of the BBC's classic Ghost Story for Christmas series, a curious scholar is seemingly tormented by a mysterious supernatural presence. The actual existence of any presence is never confirmed nor denied for the audience beyond abstract shapes and shadows which very fleetingly pass in front of the camera. Each of these screen grabs represents the spookiest moments, each of which is also a fraction of a second, to the extent to which we're left to wonder if there was anything present at all. The threats are created by suggestion and inference. They're much less distinct and knowable than in classic horror. We're not afraid in these cases of Freddy or Jason jumping out from the shadows, so there's a different type of tension for the audience. The folk horror atmosphere created is less about waiting for an expected jump scare and much more of a general unsettling eeriness. The fear in horror comes from absence rather than presence, which Mark Fisher states occurs when there is something present when there should be nothing, or there is nothing present when there should be something. In many typical examples of classic folk horror like this, there are rarely any monsters at all, merely a general sense of brooding fear and very rarely a string of spectacular on-screen deaths. When something sinister does happen, it's often likely to happen off-screen. For example, in Nigel Kneale's Beasts, character Joe, top left here, is frightened throughout by an unseen presence and strange sounds which emanate from distant woods, and the audience is never really made aware of the source. In Whistle and I'll Come to You, there's something terrifying that it might be a ghost or it might be a wispy sheet. And in A Field in England, whatever happens to Reece Shearsmith's character happens entirely out of sight in a tent before he emerges with one of probably the most unsettling grimaces in cinema history. There are, of course, exceptions when there's a visual reveal or spectacle in folk horror, #not all folk horror, of course, such as the infamous ending of The Wicker Man. But the horror tends to come from understanding the psychological impact of the moment in the context of the narrative, which can in fact be more disturbing for an audience than entertaining splashes of gore. If a monster is knowable, it's also killable. So if there's nothing there, like a wispy sheet, how do we vanquish the threat? We're often left with a very loosely open ending, aligning folk horror with art house cinema. And when there are monsters in folk horror, they're almost always people, their actions based on some kind of folkloric belief, what Adam Scoville calls skewed belief systems and morality. The threat comes from the folk themselves rather than an external or necessarily supernatural force, and their actions based on religion, custom and rituals. This narrative trope of villagers requiring a sacrifice to supposedly restore fertility to the land is used by so many classic folk horror texts, it's safe to denote this as typically conventional of the genre, perhaps even overdone, some might argue, at this stage. Interestingly, these characters are often community leaders in positions of authority, suggesting fear of class, of politicians, Illuminati, Masonic orders. And in folklore studies, the literal existence or not of these things is not the focus, but the fact that this representation recurs reveals some kind of rumbling, genuine concern or fear. It's the kind of thing from whence conspiracy theories arise. In fact, here's one of the scariest folk horror examples of this I've seen.
Surprise someone with a cameo message from me, Nigel Farage. They're a Brexiteer. It could be a birthday, a wedding, an anniversary, and I will cheer them up. But also, if you know somebody that's a Meghan Markle supporting woke warrior Ramona, well, I could really surprise them with a message, couldn't I?
So it gives me shivers every time I see that. The mise-en-scène of folk horror is most associated with the on-screen use of landscape, as in that video there, and outdoor filming. I also consider the bleak grey skies and autumnal fields of Witchfinder General, or the soft monochrome of a field in England, the bleached dreamlike lens flare of Midsummer and Antrim. This really necessitates a tendency towards daytime filming, which contrasts the cover of night more often used as a backdrop for classic horror, such as Dracula and his Children of the Night, or Freddy Krueger lurking in teenage dreamscapes. Rural folk horror settings also arguably provide a sense of realism, which with naturalistic lighting was something Piers Haggard was conscious of using in opposition to what he saw as the stifling interiors favoured by mainstream horror, again aligning folk horror with art house cinema. Where folk horror soundtracks use music, it tends to be in the form of traditional folk songs and music to evoke bygone eras or an otherworldly atmosphere. Particularly in post-2000 folk horror, music often falls into the category of hauntology, whether simplistic electronic drones, or it might be more folklore-esque, so suggestive of ancient times or pre-Christian pagan cultures. Elements of the soundtrack on Blood on Satan's Claw were crafted to suggest a kind of medieval plain song, and in the baby episode of Beasts, there is no music whatsoever. Leaving audience response undirected in this way, with there's no swelling of sad strings or high-octane kind of beat accompanying a frenzied chase, it allows for sinister interpretation of even the most benign on-screen moments, and perhaps for inexplicable events to seem all the more chilling. So just to summarise then, by kind of placing paradigm examples of folk horror alongside those more typical of mainstream classic horror, we can see that folk horror is not typical of the broader horror genre and has its own set of characteristics. Folk horror is in fact unconventional in this context. Rather than being horrific, it has a tendency to be weird, unsettling or vaguely eerie, suggesting that films like Picnic at Hanging Rock from 1975 can be aligned with folk horror, whilst perhaps films like Gremlins, not so much. The folk horror threat is unlikely to be either easily defined or vanquished. If there even was one in the first place, it might much more simply be a community, or it might even just be ourselves. Thank you very much for listening.